We do have some slides about, why we're here.
We here, Drew, and you made these slides with my help. Well, whoa, that's one reason we're here. That shows projected revenues and expenditures for the state of Alaska for the next 8 years, starting in the fiscal year, starting this next July 1st, fiscal year 21, and going through fiscal year 28. And as I recall, those figures come from the Alaska Legislative Finance Division, our state legislature's nonpartisan scorekeepers. And the blue bars for each year show the projected revenues, and the orange bars show the expenditures. And what I first note, Drew, is that every year we're down. We're down between $1 billion and $2 billion each year. Actually, I think if you add it all up and average it, we're down more than $1.5 billion, $1.5 billion each year based on this.
Yeah, so this assumes that we are paying the statutory PFD amount. It also assumes that the full POMV amount is counted towards the revenue. It assumes that we carry on with a budget very similar to the one we've had the last couple of years. So that's a lot of assumptions. And so I would say that, there's no way that our revenue is that constant. Oil prices are going to go up and down. There's nothing that says that that's necessarily the right amount of spending. It may be that we need to be spending more than is showing up in there. It may be that we could well be spending less. So there's a lot of assumptions in those numbers, but that's where they come from, legislative finance, and this is sort of the big picture of about where we're at right now.
And we're down every year. It's not just 1 year or 2 years, but it's an 8-year streak as far as the eye can see.
Yeah, I think we have what people call a structural deficit.
Whoa. Well, let's see. Wait. Aren't savings supposed to save us? Don't we have all this money?
Well, we did have an awful lot of sort of rainy day savings.
But then we have this ski slope going on. Why don't we tell people what that means?
So the SBR was the statutory budget reserve.
That's the light green one there on the top.
I say was because it's gone now.
Yeah.
And then the CBR is the constitutional budget reserve. And that's still got more than $2 billion in it. So I think a lot of states would be feeling pretty good about having just a cash account with a lot of that money in it. But you saw that where our deficits was looking at like $1.5 billion a year. And so that $2 billion isn't going to last us a real long time if we want to just sort of pay the full dividend, not have any new revenue, and have government spending at a similar level that we've had for the past couple years.
But wait a minute, just going back the last 7 years or so, we've spent more than $14 billion in savings. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Well, let's focus on that and think about what that means because, hey, we still got some savings left. I heard we have billions and billions, tens of billions.
We do.
Broken out in 3 categories here, I see.
About $50 billion is in the permanent fund principle. That's constitutionally protected, and it would take a vote of the people in order to get in there and start spending that money. I haven't really heard anybody talking too seriously about a desire to do that. We also have the earnings reserve, which of the slices of the pie is actually the sort of, logistically speaking, the easiest to get at. It just takes a simple vote of the majority of the legislature to spend from that account.
And no veto from the governor. It's not overridden.
Of course.
Right.
But then that's where we get the POMV out of. So the POMV is the percent of market value, where we take the whole pie minus the CBR. And we take about 5% of it every year because we figure it's going to earn about 5%. And so we can sustainably, sort of without eating into our nest egg, pull off what comes out to about $3 billion. So real rough numbers, but that's so the POMV is telling us already that we ought to be taking $3 billion out of here, and anything more than that is sort of likely to be in the long term more than it's earning year to year. So if we start taking more than $3 billion in any given year out of this one, we're going to see that it's going to earn less the next year, and then if we take out the same amount, it earns less, and we enter into a sad spiral.
And even if we spend a lot of that money out of that permanent earnings reserve in a short time, we could even take the risk of totally going bust in terms of ending up with zero if the stock market went bad for a while, as it has.
I think that he's referring to the PFD, and there was 1 year when the stock market did real poorly that the earnings reserve really didn't have much of any money into it until kind of the 11th hour, and then the stock market rallied a bit, and we had plenty of money in there to pay out dividends.
But there are even possibilities that if you draw down that permanent earnings reserve, at some point you couldn't make the money to even pay out your POMV to pay for conventional public services. Mm-hmm. Right, another substantial risk. And the CBR, as we said, is a little over $2 billion. under the savings pots. Okay, now let's look at revenues, like the history of revenues here in Alaska. So we got an historical graph that starts in fiscal year 1975, which is before the big oil era started. That was even before the pipeline started having oil flow through it. And so this shows how the state has gotten revenues each year. And this blue line shows that, well, we had some spikes, in revenues, overwhelmingly oil revenues, and UGF is, of course, stands for Unrestricted General Fund, which is the category people usually talk about and what they think of when they talk about the budget, because it's the money that's under the legislature's control. And we can see there were some spikes here, but I see another ski slope. And now you put real per capita terms, and that ski slopes get even steeper, way scarier. And we see we had all kinds of money there, Drew, in the early 1980s, a very euphoric time. I worked in the Alaska legislature at the end, and money was just rolling in. I could do a whole another 2 hours on that by itself. And then in the last 15 years, we've had two other spikes, and then a real deep fall, and especially when you put it in real per capita terms like you did in terms of adjusted for inflation and for population growth, because back in the 70s, there was dollars went way further than they do today, and there were way fewer people in Alaska than there are now. Great, Drew, what else would you say about that revenues graphic?
Oh, the one thing I would say is that I was really surprised looking at the unadjusted numbers that when we built the Performing Arts Center and the Sullivan Arena and stuff like that, looks so much lower than the heyday that I lived through. But then you adjust for real per capita and you start to see why the 80s were such a flush time.
Super flush. So now you did this other graphic, Drew, and with oil revenue and all the other revenue. Why don't you explain what you did with this graphic?
So this one just kind of shows how our oil revenues compare to the revenues we were getting from all of our other sources. And you go back way over here to before oil was flowing through the pipeline. And that's how far back you have to go before we were getting more money from any set of sources that weren't petroleum than we were from petroleum. And then as you move into the 80s and everything, petroleum clearly takes over. Royalties and production tax are the two that you hear talked about the most. Those are the big ones. The production tax in particular has been more volatile, and it's been our big windfalls. It's also the thing that shrinks way down here near zero when the oil prices were like $20 a barrel. Our royalties are a little bit more consistent, but don't have quite those windfalls in the high years.
I noticed two other things with this graphic, Drew, one at the far left end and one at the far right hand. The far left end is we got more money in the 70s from non-oil than from oil, and those are the days, of course, when we had a personal income tax in Alaska that got repealed in 1980. And then over the far right end, why don't you explain a little bit more why that blue line goes up so much?
So we've mentioned a couple times the percent of market value. When the legislature passed that was the first time we went to getting more money from sources other than oil than we had from oil. And so, yeah, that's a real significant amount of revenue for government spending that we have not really been seeing prior to having passed that.
And you'll sometimes also hear that bill that passed that was Senate Bill 26 that was adopted by the legislature in 2018. So let's talk about spending. So we also go with the same historical graphic that you put on, starting in fiscal year 1975 and running out all the way to the projected spending in fiscal year 2021, the year that's fiscal year that starts on July 1st. And we note a couple things about this. Number one, we see that there was this spike in the 80s, and then some in the last 15 years, but dropped off much more recently. And we can also talk about the categories. The blue is the agency operations, which is what most people think of when they talk about the budget. They think about the salaries for the state troopers or the state social workers, or for the paying for the lights at the University of Alaska buildings. And then the gray is the capital budget, and then the orangish is statewide operations, which include things like payment of the state's back of the state's bond debt when the state borrows money and issues a bond, or payment for the unfunded liabilities of the public employees retirement system, the teacher retirement system, PERS and TERS, which grew a lot in the late 90s and in the early 2000s, that debt. And then the third, a payment in recent years of oil tax credits. So that's the the unadjusted, just the actual dollars going out. Drew, do you have anything else to say about this?
No, not really. I guess the one thing that I might mention is that you look recently, we've actually had some not insubstantial cuts to agency
Yes.
operations. You look at the late 90s, early 2000s, our sort of other period of austerity, and we didn't have the falling off the cliff that we did when oil prices really cratered after being so high. And so instead, we just trimmed our capital budget down to sort of the bare minimum we needed to get the like 10-to-1 federal match. We stopped making as many payments and stuff on debt service and things like that. So we just really kind of tightened our belts and muddled through, but we didn't cut away portions of state government and everything the way that arguably after some years of fairly steep growth here, we trimmed back over the last 5 or 6 years.
Wait, Drew, do you have another way of showing this information?
I do.
Yes, real per capita, once again, adjusting for inflation and for population growth. Once again, we see just how high that budget went in the early 80s.
Yeah, those capital budgets look really, really big right now.
Dude, it was incredible. Like I said, could do 2 hours alone on that. And then we have some spikes here in the last 15 years, but we also see a pretty sharp drop as the budget has fallen in real per capita terms. And as I eyeball this, Drew, the budget now in real per capita terms looks about as low as it has been since it was throughout this era, and what it was before the big oil era started in the late 70s and early 80s.
Yep.
Okay.
I guess the one thing to say about real per capita is a number of people are tempted to treat it as though it's a better one-to-one sort of a thing, and you just should remember economies of scale and modern technology and everything. There's a lot that's changed since the 70s, and if you had 100 people and it costs you $100 to take care of them, maybe you don't expect that providing the same set of service is going to cost you $200 for 200 people. Maybe you can sort of reach a similar level with 1.5 times as much. So I think that both are sort of instructive data sets to look at, but a grain of salt for the real per capita numbers.
Okay, so Drew, you made this graphic. You thought of it, you designed it. I'm gonna let you talk about it.
Well, so this is one of the ones that I think is the most surprising of a graph that I've made, and was like, really? That's what it looks like? And so the Bureau of Economic Analysis is a federal agency, and they publish state GDP data, and they break it down by all the industries. And so you can go in there and you can pull out just one industry. And so I took out the mining industry, which is both hard rock mining and oil and gas, but it's a vast majority oil and gas, and then left everything else. And so if you look at these stacked for the whole Alaska state GDP, the whole thing takes a bit of a dive here, and the whole thing takes a bit of a downturn here. But if you look at the rest of our economy, all of the sectors, transportation, health, some other big ones,
Tourism, fishing, mining.
timber, just about every industry that was present here has grown substantially. And it's not that there's been one big slice of this that has just been the new thing that took over. As oil, which has always been our sort of big cash cow, goes up and down, everything else has grown really steadily. So everybody who talks about the need to diversify the Alaska economy has been realizing their dream for the last 20 years. Especially from here on, we have had really insane economic growth. I think likely part of that is because we don't tax anything else. We sort of subsidize the whole rest of our economy. All the roads that you drive on to get your products to and from customers, the schools that your employees' kids go to work at, all of that gets paid for in Alaska sort of by somebody else. And so that's allowed all these other things to do really well.
Well, Drew, that insane economic growth, that must mean the last 5 years or so that the population has doubled each year here in the state. Has that happened?
No.
Not quite. Actually, it's been falling.
Not really the way GDP works.
Yeah, but it's falling. The population's actually been falling most of the last 5 years.
Yeah.
What I also note is that just because there's different ways of measuring the economic sectors, that blue line tends to have way more of what economists call rent, that there's more profit in the blue line, and the oil workers tend to make more money than your average tourism or worker or other.
Yeah, and we're talking a lot about the state budget, and so it's just important to remember that it might, if it costs you $30 to get a barrel of oil out of the ground, then, at $150 a barrel, the government can take 2/3 of what that oil is worth, and you still make $50 taking it out of the ground. So it's still worth it for you to do that. For an awful lot of the things in here, if the government were to walk in and say, okay, we want 2/3 of all the revenue you get off of that, people just drop their tools and walk away. Nothing happens. And so, yeah, our ability as an owner state in particular to take value from our resource in this sector is not really replicable anywhere else.
Drew, got another graphic here? I think you do. And actually, this is one that I helped build. And this, people often ask, what's in the budget? And so this goes and shows you what's in the budget by category. And it's in FY19, the most recently completed year, because we're still in fiscal year 20 now. So the biggest category in the budget is education, and that would mean kindergarten through 12th grade, K through 12, plus some pre-kindergarten in it, but not the University of Alaska, which is its own category.
And Cliff, if I could jump in. The one important thing to note about education is, aside from being something that every good red-blooded American is really excited about, it's also something we've already lost a couple of court cases on because we cut them. And so if we were to spend much less on education, it seems pretty likely we'd get sued and we'd lose, and we'd have to go back to spending the money. And it just doesn't seem pragmatically like a real practical way forward without some pretty major policy shifts around the way that we're delivering education.
It's paid out in a formula, and I think critically to understand is, although most of the teachers in Alaska get their checks signed by Anchorage School District, Fairbanks School District, most of the money for the pay the teachers in Alaska comes from the state of Alaska. The next category is health and human services, health and social services. And the biggest category there would be Medicaid. The third biggest outlay for the state of Alaska is permanent fund dividends, which many people in this room may know that I, along with Rick Halford, helped create back in the 80s. And the dividend shown as the third biggest outlay is because with the actual dividend that was paid that year, if it was paid on the statutory formula that was created in the 1980s, obviously by far the highest.
Yeah, it would have been someplace
bar.
up here.
Right. I think a couple other interesting ones are the University of Alaska is the fourth largest expenditure for the state of Alaska. The state retirement payments, which are the state accountant speak for the unfunded liabilities that PERS and TERS I was telling you about before, are actually the sixth largest outlay for the state of Alaska. And then we go down for some other things that are more famous but smaller, like the DOT-PUF budget, the Department of Transportation and Public Facilities, the capital budget, the troopers, public safety, and all the other categories running down. So that's what actually the state pays for. And notice, like I said, some categories, the three big ones in particular, are way larger than the others. So now let's talk about another graphic, which is some policy options for dealing with the big average deficit of more than $1.5 billion a year over the next 8 years. That's the hole. So what are various ways to fill the hole? And I'm not in any way endorsing or attacking any one of these, but one that some people have talked about is eliminate the dividend. The dividend is about $2 billion a year the next few years under the statutory formula, and then goes up past $2.5 billion towards some of the out years in 7 or 8 years from now. But that's one option some people have talked about. Another option some people have talked about, and you'll hear as well some tonight perhaps, is an income tax. The Alaska House of Representatives passed an income tax in 2017 that would have brought in about $700 million a year. The governor's office has recently pointed out there could be another kind of income tax created that brings in about $600 million a year. So that's sort of the range that people talk about the income tax is often $600, $700 million a year. The governor's office has recently pointed out that if you had a sales tax of 5% with no exemptions and taxed internet sales as well, you might be able to raise $900 million. I told Drew when we were going over these graphics this morning that if the state of Alaska passing a sales tax with no exemptions at 5% is sort of like me losing 30 pounds the next 3 months. Possible, but do not bet your house on it in any way. Because it's very hard, as someone who used to administer sales taxes, it's very hard to, for local government, it's very hard to have a sales tax without exemptions. There's another discussion about the smallest item on this chart, which is tripling the motor fuels tax. Notice that that's by far the smallest. The governor's office might raise $80 million. The state of Alaska does have the lowest oil taxes, lowest motor fuel taxes in the country, but tripling it would bring in, say, $80 million. As I said, way far the smallest bar. And then finally, there's some discussion in Alaska, including on the stage tonight, about increasing oil taxes. And there's various proposals to do that. There's a proposal for an initiative to go on the ballot that would raise oil taxes by about $1 billion a year. Some legislators have talked about passing another piece of legislation that might raise oil taxes by on the order of more like $600 million a year. Drew, do you have any other additional thoughts?
Just that I was kind of reluctant to make this graphic.
I know, I forced you.
I guess if you have problems with any of these, you're probably right. They all just matter what the policy is. It was an attempt to give some scale for graphically just seeing, because people talk about it, and I don't know how many times I've heard, oh, well, marijuana taxes, that's gonna, isn't that gonna save us? And even when things like tripling the motor fuels tax, that's real money. I think that looks like $80 million, because I think we get about 40 now, so tripling it, getting two more times that. $80 million is enough to do a ton of stuff and change a bunch of people's lives drastically. It doesn't really compare all that much to the size of the deficit we have. So it's not a value statement over how good or bad an idea it is, and these aren't meant to be statements over what the potential capacity or what's most likely even really is. It's just kind of attempt to take and pick out some of the big threads that people have really been talking about, some of the real proposals that people have put on the table, and show what those proposals, what those things people have been talking about look like relative to a $1.5 billion structural deficit.
And Drew, since you brought up the marijuana tax, I'm going to talk about something that I've been asked all around the state about, the state lottery. The governor's office says that would raise $15 million a year. So that wouldn't be sort of like the width of my fingernail.
So this is 500.
That's
so
80.
15 would be,
like the width of my, like I said, maybe a credit card, the width of a credit card. So in terms of popular proposals and alternatives I've sometimes heard. So Drew, I'm going to give it to you now to actually go into our mini debates since we've done our problem statement of what the problem is.
So I guess we're going to start off with substantial additional budget cuts. And introducing the topic for us in favor of said additional substantial budget cuts is Melodie Wilterdink, the Associate Director of the Alaska Policy Forum. Thank you, Melodie.
Hi, so thank you for having me here, Alaska Common Ground. I am delighted to see that there are so many people really engaged on this topic, and I could not be happier to be presenting something that is, so popular. So let's get into this. I am debating in favor, like you said, of substantial additional budget cuts. So we all know there are two ways to close a budget gap. It is increasing revenue or reducing spending. I'm not here to argue against the careful consideration of revenue increasing options, but I am here to say that our budget gap is so large, substantial spending reductions are still going to be necessary again this year. We're dealing with a grim reality in Alaska, as you've seen from the charts we just saw, but we still have time to make a course correction. As we all know, Alaska's government has run almost entirely on oil revenue for many years. Back in 2008, the petroleum-derived revenues soared to over $12 billion, and they stayed above $5 billion through 2014, so they were very flush years. But now, with production and prices low, we're seeing these huge budget deficits that have dwindled our reserve down to, as you saw on the chart, $2.1 billion left. Back in 2014, we had $19 billion between our two budget reserve funds. So on top of that, the governor's proposed budget would move another $1.5 billion into our spending for fiscal year 2021, leaving just $500 million in those funds for future years. Now, additionally, our unrestricted general fund revenues are estimated to be about $2 billion for the upcoming fiscal year, but the proposed unrestricted fund spending is $4.5 billion. Obviously, these numbers are not adding up. On top of that, state analysts expect that our per barrel crude oil prices from the North Slope are going to take until 2029 to get back to the already low 2019 levels that we saw last year. So what are we dealing with here? Is this a revenue slump, a rainy day, or a new normal for the state of Alaska? And that's really what we have to consider. So without spending reductions, we risk pushing this problem into next year when we'll only have $500 million left in savings and as oil revenues continue to decline. And the situation could be even worse than we expect because demand for oil has plummeted in China due to the coronavirus. So now's the time to act. Policymakers have this opportunity. We see the problem, we know it's coming, to go and discuss with their communities what can be cut, what government funding can be cut, and what is absolutely essential before the crisis really hits and we end up having to take haircuts on even our most basic programs. That's really what we're looking at, even with the 50-50 POMV draw that you saw, and a stable budget with including inflation means a lower budget every year. We're looking at big, big, big deficits. But it's not all bad news. There should be room for reducing spending still. Back in 2016, fiscal year 2016, when Alaska's population was at its peak, the operating budget was $8.5 billion, and that's actually lower than the proposed operating budget this year of $8.9 billion. We're spending more money now, but on fewer people. And in fact, it's $14,475 per person, which is higher than any other state and over twice the national average. There's gotta be some room here. So despite that, we know, everybody who was in Alaska last year, that the budget cuts were difficult and they were painful. But the idea that tax increases would be less painful is misguided. Whether it's instituting broad-based taxes, which we might hear about tonight, or increasing taxes on oil production, it's gonna be felt by Alaskans, whether it's in reduced paychecks, fewer job opportunities, or increased cost of living. And as we know, it's already expensive to live here. But by carefully reducing spending now, we can prepare our state and its residents to flourish in what will likely be lean future years. So that's what we're dealing with. While I'm not here to say that revenue options shouldn't be thoughtfully considered, a plan to balance the budget with only revenue increases and no spending reductions will only stifle our private economy and negatively impact the job prospects for Alaskans who already face the highest unemployment rate in the country. Substantial cuts are going to be necessary to rebalance our fiscal situation and foster prosperity. Just as the rest of us as Alaskans have to manage our household budgets, the state of Alaska needs to manage our spending responsibly to create a stable economic future for individuals and businesses. And if we're responsible now, we can look forward to a bright future and a strong economy. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Melodie. And now I'd like to welcome the Right Honorable Les Gara to present on behalf of the opposition.
Thank you, Drew. I'm supporting our local business, and I also just wrote on my pants, and so they might be related. I don't know. The question really that we're facing right now is a serious one. It's, do we want an Alaska that people want to live in, or do we want an Alaska that people are going to leave? That's the crossroads we're at. Obviously, things are expensive in Alaska. You heard that we spend a lot of money here. And at statehood, that was debated. Would Alaska, with its vast land and few roads and lack of economies of scale, be able to fund their own government? Right? And that's why Alaskans were granted their right to subsurface rights, so we could help fund our government, because things are more expensive up here. It's more expensive to ship materials out to Bethel to build a school than it is in Kansas to drive those right down the road to the neighboring town. That's just a reality. Let's go to something that our think tank at the university, ICER, came up with in a study, which is that every $100 million in budget cuts isn't fun. Every $100 million in budget cuts costs us about 1,000 jobs. Jobs that aren't created are jobs that people lose in the private and public sector combined. How does that happen? Less money in the economy, less money for people to go to restaurants with, less money for people to hire a contractor with. It ripples through the economy. Well, we haven't just cut $100 million from the budget. And when we have this debate, I'm surprised to always hear, like, people don't think that we've ever started cutting the budgets. Well, let's talk about reality. Since fiscal year 2015, the state has cut agency spending by $650 million. That has hurt seniors. It's hurt kids. We're one of 10 states in this country that don't have statewide pre-K, yet we complain that our kids don't read very well at fourth grade. Shocking, right? $650 million in cuts just to agencies. Education has been basically flat funded from since FY15, but measured against inflation, which is a real thing that schools have to pay for, we're $90 million down. Well, we're just talking dollars, but let's talk people. That means class sizes have gone up in every single major school district in the state. Anchorage, Fairbanks, Juneau, Ketchikan, Kenai, Kodiak. Class sizes have gone up. We've lost 1,000 teachers and staff because of that $90 million loss. Okay, these things are real. We're providing less opportunity to the next generation by not taking action. Okay, we've cut the budget, $650 so far in operating, and we've cut about $400 million from the average capital budget for construction projects, for maintaining the Anchorage port that's falling apart right now. That used to be an average of about $500 million of state funding. It's now down to about $100 million of state funding. In total, in all state spending, we've cut about $3 billion from the budget since FY15. Just agency and capital budgets, about $1.1 billion. So it's not like nobody's cut the budget. And it's not like there haven't been effects. Just at the university, that's been cut by about $75 million, but the plan is to go down to a $120 million cut within the next two years. We've lost 500 faculty. We've lost 4,000 students in the last 4 years. When you go to the University of Alaska and you graduate, you are more likely to stay in Alaska and keep your job skills here for our economy. When you go outside to the university, you're more likely to never come back. We're shipping our job talent out of state right now because of those cuts to the university. So let's not say that we haven't been cutting the budget. We've been cutting it harmfully. If this is a state that you want to live in, if that's your goal. We've fallen so far behind on construction spending that we're $2 billion behind on deferred maintenance at the university and in state buildings and infrastructure. Those buildings are going to start leaking. They're going to become much more expensive to maintain by ignoring them, right? So it's not really a pretty picture. And it's not a picture that you hear when people say, hey, you should start cutting the budget. Where have you been the last 5 years? The budget has been slashed. Ask a senior citizen living at the Pioneer Home. Ask a senior citizen who is told they're going to lose their senior benefits. Those are the kind of things we're cutting right now. We're cutting at bone now. We're not recreationally cutting anymore. Adjusted per capita for inflation, we're at about the lowest budget we've been at for the last 40 years. Okay? And 40 years ago, we had fewer communities where we had to maintain water and sewer. 40 years ago, we didn't have renewable energy that we would want in our communities, right? There are more things today that make sense today that actually cost money, but we're at about the lowest level we've been at in 40 years. So when you say cut the budget, now it's time really to say who you want to hurt. Is it the next generation? Do you want parents who are already talking about leaving with their job skills to leave and taking their engineering degrees out of the state? So we can't take this crisis out on our seniors. And it's really, I'll just leave you with a quote from Wally Hickel that gets mangled over and over and over by people. I'll just shorten it instead of mangling it. And what Governor Hickel, a pretty conservative guy, said was there's no vision, no hope, no future, no agenda for Alaska if your only cause is to cut the budget. Thank you.
Now we're going to give them each a microphone and let them sit next to each other and ask some questions if we get some question cards handed up. But while I'm waiting to see if the audience has any questions, I'll go ahead and fire off one. Melodie, since you went first, you know what? I'll go ahead and make Les go first for this one. So, Representative Gara, I think that without really casting any doubt or relating to a lot of the points that you were making, many people in the audience have likely dealt with a portion of state government that seem to be behaving rather sillily. They've dealt with requirements that seem like, why is this requirement here, and why are you paying someone to impose this requirement on me? So my question for you is that, aside from the question of sort of whether or not we should have major cuts, if we just go ahead and accept that we've cut enough, and yet we still see these things where we seem to be spending money in silly ways, where does the pressure to become more efficient come from, if not from sort of an abstracted look at the total and start looking for the best place to take it to make reductions?
Your job, I think, as a policymaker is not just to make a cut. You know, the legislature used to say, let's just do 10% here. Well, what's the impact on human beings? You have to study that first. Your job is to figure out what the impact is of what you're going to do and not to do it if you're going to hurt people, right? So yeah, find waste, find efficiencies. I will guarantee you at this point, there are efficiencies you can find, just like at your insurance company that takes forever to get back at you on a claim, right? I mean, at big institutions, there are inefficiencies. There's no doubt. But those inefficiencies pale in comparison to what's underfunded in the state at this point. One of 10 states that doesn't have statewide pre-K, but we complain that our kids aren't reading well. I mean, that's insane. So, yeah, I mean, we're falling behind on schools. There are inefficiencies. Those inefficiencies are not going to make up for what we need to do to build a future in this state. You know, it would be a different discussion if we hadn't started cutting the budget at this point. But we've been cutting it for 5 years. And at this point, people are getting hurt. Go over to the Pioneer Home on 11th Avenue and ask somebody.
All right, thanks a bunch. I guess, Melodie, do you want to take a crack at that? No, you don't have to. It wasn't really directed at you, but I feel like I ought to give you an opportunity if you were just itching to say something.
No, that's okay. Thank you.
Okay. So I think that last year, many of us were sort of paying attention and saw the governor propose a significant number of pretty substantial budget reductions above and beyond what we've seen this year. I think that Donna Arduin became a somewhat household name around the state. Do you think that he did it wrong? Do you think that people just weren't there for it, even though they should have been? Do a little bit of a postmortem on the governor's budget last year and what he came up with this year, and sort of how does that sort of compare and contrast with your statement that we have a lot of cuts left to make?
Well, after last year's budget, I was personally pretty surprised that the governor proposed a pretty stable budget this year, knowing the difference in revenue that we were going to see anyway, and even lower revenue than we saw last year. It was a brave budget last year, certainly. Nobody wants to be the person to come out and say, I'm sorry, we don't have any money. But that's the situation that we're in, and I think at this point now it is up to our legislature to figure out what we're going to do, because the governor has not proposed something that is viable. Not this year. I mean, we can get away with it this year, but this is really the last year we can get away with it. We are out of money.
And this one's on a bit of a different topic, but by way of teaser, I'll ask you both as a last question. Someone has written, the budget deficit is caused by the PFD. Why not reduce the PFD? It's up to you.
I took the last one. You can go first.
Look, I'm glad that question was asked. You know, there was a time if we acted quick, you could either raise oil taxes in a fair way, or raise a fair income tax, or raise a fair sales tax, or come up with a modest cut to the PFD, and you would have solved the budget deficit. But we've waited so long that no one of those solutions even works now. You have to have at least two of those solutions. That's how long we've waited. You know, I would say, you hear the story, you hear the line, you know, if you don't have enough money, you got to tighten your belt. That's what we do at my house. Well, if you can't feed your kids or send your kids to college, you might get a second job too. It's time to raise revenue. Thanks.
Well, I actually agree. You know, we have such a huge budget gap that this will be very difficult to close if we do it with just massive spending reductions or just huge tax increases. It's not going to be easy either way, but I would not recommend getting rid of the PFD. The PFD is a form of income, and like any other dividend that you might get from a stock. And every single time that we reduce the PFD below the statutory level, it is an income tax on Alaskans. And unfortunately, it is a very regressive income tax. It takes a larger portion of the income from our families in poverty than it does from our wealthy families. So taking it away is a very, very poorly structured income tax.
Right on.
I agree with a bit of that.
Hey, we're making progress already. Look at that. So on that high note, let's go ahead and move ourselves on to the next topic. And see, I would like to invite, I think Scott Kendall is up next to talk about why continuing to spend a significant portion of the PUMV, even if it means reduced dividends on government services, is a good idea.
Well, I could start with we have no choice, but I'm gonna give a more nuanced explanation than that. First off, I just want to say my debate partner here, Senator Halford, he served Alaska for the better part of 5 decades as Air National Guard in the House, in the state Senate. I've worked with him in the past and have an absolute respect for him. And frankly, if we had more Rick Halfords in the state, we probably wouldn't be in the mess we're in now. I will say as a starting point, oh, go ahead. As a starting point now, I'm going to apologize to the other panelists, but I'm going to touch on their topics because I think you have to. As we've touched on, oil and gas taxes can't do this alone. At some point, you can tax oil and gas, but at some point there is an economic reality that you'll kill investment and oil and gas production will stop. There is a mathematical tipping point. To think you won't impact investment behavior is ridiculous. That's just economics. And additionally, does it make sense, as was discussed in the opening, to have one industry pay the way of every other industry, mining, tourism, you name it? And again, putting our entire state budget, state economy on one commodity is foolhardy to say the least. Even if we tripled taxes on the oil and gas industry, oil hits $20 a barrel, here we are again having this discussion. As was just discussed, budget cuts alone won't do it. I won't go into details because Les did a great job, but I will say this. We had the most anti-spending governor in the history of the state right now. We went through a year unlike anyone in Alaska has ever seen, and we ended up with a 1.5% budget cut and a $1,600 PFD. The debate on budget cuts of the magnitude needed to balance the budget is over. The public won't stand for it. So. And I also think that discussion misses the point. A full dividend means a larger budget. Spending is spending, and any budget from Governor Dunleavy that includes a full dividend will be much larger than any budget we've seen in 6 or 7 or 8 years. So, which isn't to say cuts aren't part of the solution, but you can't do it all right there. And broad-based revenue at some point certainly has to be part of the solution, but here's why you have to use part of the permanent fund earnings reserve. When I worked in the governor's office, I had Commissioner Fisher run me a simulation. Pretend Alaska is the highest taxed zip code in the country. Lay that over our economy, and what we had was a deficit still of over $500 million. We don't have enough human beings earning enough money, spending enough money to balance the budget by any conventional means, which was the genius of the permanent fund. Set aside the resource in a financial way so we can keep those money, we can keep pumping money for years to come. And I'm not arguing for the end of the PFD, but permanent fund earnings have to be part of the solution. Alaska is a high-cost state. These apples-to-apples comparisons just don't work. Moving to the dividend itself, full dividends in the sense of the statutory calculation are not sustainable. Currently, a full PFD is larger than any state expenditure. It's larger than all of the Department of Education. It's larger than all of the Department of Health and Social Services. It's larger than the smallest 8 or 9 state departments combined. Currently, right now, paying a full dividend is in excess of 35% of all revenue. That's not POMV, that's oil and gas taxes, everything the state brings in. We're going to say we have a budget crisis, we're going to send a third of it back out in taxes. If you look at the projections, that amount could easily get to 50% or in excess of 50% of all state revenue. And it's not as though we're at a time when state services are flush. We have ferry system falling apart. We have a university falling apart. We have the $2 billion in deferred maintenance. We have buildings falling apart. The federal government's taking notice. The Trump administration has just taken action to end the Denali Commission because they say if you're sending money to every single resident, you don't need help from us. Also, the current calculation is not logical in that the way it's not calculated in any way that any retirement account or sovereign wealth fund or anyone would balance their books. It's the 5-year average of statutory net income, and that gets distorted in a number of ways. For one, an ongoing bull market like we're in right now boosts the numbers up to where dividends would be $4,000, even $5,000. It's also distorted because one-time profits like the liquidation of a real estate holding drives up the realized gains. The POMV is tied to a percentage of market value. So they're totally at disconnect with one another. The sad irony is if we had a massive stock market crash right now, the amount of money available for state services would go through the roof because the statutory calculation of our dividend would go down dramatically and the amount available would go up because it wouldn't impact the actual real value of the permanent fund at the same time. Well, and I guess I would take the converse of that too. There's actually a point at which if you had bull markets for long enough, you could actually have paying the dividend alone would actually exceed the POMV value. So it's simply not logical. And I think one place for common ground I would seek with Mr. Halford is however we calculate the dividend going forward, it needs to be some portion of that POMV draw because that's how we're going to sustain and not break the money machine that is the permanent fund. One very last point, and I know my time is up, is the permanent fund dividend has been reduced. It's been reduced by a cumulative amount of about $3.2 billion. And every child has felt that, every elderly person has felt that. My kids have been taxed to the same degree I have. But I will say that $3.2 billion that sits in the permanent fund that wouldn't be there otherwise spins off about $180 to $240 million per year, and it will do that forever. And in perspective, that's triple the entire reduction to the university system. That's the entire budget and then some of the Department of Public Safety. It's the entire budget and then some of the Department of Transportation. It is 20 times what we spend on all pre-K in this state. And I would ask that how wealthy is someone if they have an extra $1,000 in their dividend but they don't have public safety or education? So with that, I'll conclude.
Thank you very much, and I'd now like to welcome Senator Halford to speak on behalf of the opposition.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity. I think I'm probably going to agree with a number of things that everyone says, but I agree with them in a little different order. I think that going into the permanent fund system in the way that we have done in the last 3 or 4 years has been the most regressive, anti-rural, anti-Alaskan, and just a terrible thing to do to a system that has been used as an example by the World Bank. It is viewed as a light in terms of, the world is full of countries that are incredibly rich in resource and incredibly poor in people. The debate goes on forever whether trickle down works better than feed the grassroots. But the fact is that the permanent fund system has been incredibly successful. Things like the CIA World Fact Book, which is an obscure thing just by name, but says that the people of Alaska know more about the permanent fund than the owners of any other public fund on earth. It's because of the connection. And we've gone through some very, very difficult times. It's hard to know what is worse. It's regressive, anti-rural, anti-Alaskan. It's the last choice. And it's also economically the worst place to go in terms of its impact. If we have a terrible reaction out of what's going on in China right now, and the economy is in trouble, the place that makes the most difference is probably feeding the bottom with the permanent fund dividend. There was a recession in the oil industry but the taking of the dividend, and the dividend all comes out in the fall. It's grub stake time for rural Alaska. It's a time when it has a huge impact. People on the lower end of the economic spectrum save the least, spend the most, and spend it the fastest. The impact of the veto on what happened to the economy spread the oil industry recession across Alaska to every single place, every single family, and it didn't take a single thing from anybody who wasn't an Alaskan. It was the absolute worst choice. Now, I try to figure out what is, in terms of what are the alternatives? How do we put something together? Because I agree, and I think I'm probably going to agree with just about everything said here, with maybe a few exceptions in terms of the order of it. But it is going to take some kind of combination to make things work. But I think the most important thing in the success of the Permanent Fund, as written by Dave Rose, Elmer Rasmussen, and all the people that were involved in the long time that it took to come up with a package. You know, the amendment passed in '76. The fund management didn't really get going, and the dividend didn't get going until '82. There was a huge amount of discussion and a lot of minds involved. But the most important thing was the connection between the dividend and the fund. We thought that in statute, with a provision in the last phrase of the constitutional amendment, was bulletproof. No governor, all the way through to Governor Walker, ever vetoed those funds, and we didn't think he could. The veto came, the legislature went along, and the court followed suit after the fact. But the bottom line is the greatest protection of the Permanent Fund. Its management, its investment, its inflation proofing. And the inflation proofing, by the way, wasn't as much from Hammond as it was from Elmer Rasmussen. He put a huge amount of energy in as the first chairman of that fund and did a fantastic job making it what it is today. Half of its value is inflation proofing and additional deposits. But, you know, the bottom line, to say that we're crippled by, I just like this, we're crippled by a structural deficit. Bull. We're the most spoiled people under the American flag anywhere in the world. Nobody would think that we can have the resources we have and not get what we should get for our resources and not pay for what we want. So there's two sides to that part of it. And yes, I think the Permanent Fund needs to be part of the solution, but it will be part of the solution only if, and by the way, without a constitutional amendment, POMV is not constitutional because it only works as long as you have the reserve. As soon as it pays out enough to invade the principal, it's unconstitutional. And that needs to be taken into effect. There was a lot of discussion about a POMV system, and it is used in a lot of other things. But those are designed not for a savings account, but for a trust account to guarantee a beneficiary a secure thing. There was no agreement at the time of the Permanent Fund on exactly what it was for. There were a lot of arguments in every direction. But basically, Elmer Rasmussen said it best, it was a negative purpose to stop waste and stop what was happening. You notice these charts started in 1975. That was after we got the $900 million, and our budget went from $118 million through the roof for the first 3 or 4 years. We ran out of money before the pipeline was finished and had to have a prepaid tax to carry us. So the reason for the Permanent Fund was also partially because of what happened in spending. But, you know, the bottom line is that we should go to the Permanent Fund earnings, and the earnings can support a statutory dividend. The reason that the budget reserve is, that the Permanent Fund reserve is so big is because the system saves more than it needs because it's paying inflation proofing after the fact, and we've done better than inflation proofing and the dividends of half the earned income. But the system can be a part of the solution. It needs to be in the Constitution or people won't trust it and it won't work in the long term. That's the greatest benefit of the Permanent Fund, is that it is something that people trusted. They didn't care if their dividend went out, up and down. They saw it in the market. That wasn't the problem. It was when The political process took it, and we continued to spend money in some of the things that, by the way, are off budget. There's huge amounts of money in AHFC and other places that people shuffle around and do projects with and then reduce the general fund and say it's a budget cut. But we don't have all the money that the state is holding on the table. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Halford. So, Mr. Kendall, let's go ahead and grant some of your wishes and say we're no longer using the statutory formula, and now we're looking at 50% of the POMV going to government services and 50% going to PFDs. That still leaves us with $1 billion or so hole in our budget. The sort of thing that I think a lot of people have suggested is too much. Are you okay? Is that sufficient sort of for government services out of the earnings reserve? Or would you advocate for sort of continuing to take even more than that? And if so, why take from the one asset that your daughter owns equally to you? Shouldn't you pay a bit more for services given that you have an income?
So a lot to unpack there, but I think you were asking whether some calculation based off the POMV, call it a 50-50. Now you're improving the budget situation greatly then, because you're outlaying less for the PFD, so you're making the budget smaller and you're increasing revenue in a sense. At that point, the deficit may become something approachable with an income tax. I'm not saying an income tax is the answer or a sales tax is the answer. But when you get to a point where with $700 million in revenue, you're talking about $150, $200 million deficit, it's something as you ramp up a tax you can perhaps manage. The primary point is to calibrate it to the POMV, acknowledge that the POMV or the permanent fund supporting state services is as important a goal as is paying out the dividend. I would go back to, if you're a child in a village of 50 people and everyone there gets $1,000 more, are they better off with that $1,000 more? Are they better off with public safety and a ferry system that operates? I would make the foundational argument that there is a collective good that state use of the POMV or permanent fund for that purpose serves, that there's got to be a balance. Is that balance 50-50 of the POMV? Is that balance 2% out of the 5%? I think that's the discussion. If you have the discussion within those boundaries, then the state's winning, because that's not the discussion we're having right now. Right now, we're having a discussion of shutting down ferries, laying down schools, laying down airports, letting buildings fall apart in the service of a $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 check. And that is not a discussion that serves current Alaskans or future Alaskans at all.
That was a very responsive response to a complex question. Mr. Halford, if I heard you right, it sounds like you're saying that sort of the way that we've gone about things so far has been about the worst possible way we could have gone about things. But I think I want to go back to one of the things you said, which is that Alaskans are very, very connected to the permanent fund. Do you think there was any other way to get us to where we were today in terms of having the public buy-in to make some of these difficult decisions aside from doing that? Because it certainly, if you look at the polling numbers from a couple years ago, Alaskans were not on board with really any of the alternatives.
Well, I mean, you're getting the alternatives today. Each of these things is they're out there. We're still exporting $12 to $14 billion worth of oil every year. And we're getting royalty for it and almost nothing else. And in bad years, the royalty is used to pay the credits that exceed the taxes. Alaskans pay about $5.2 billion worth of federal income taxes a year. When we had an income tax, it was 16% of the federal, but the federal was the pre-Reagan schedules that went to 70% on the high end. So we had a fairly high state income tax. There is a capacity to do what was on the board in terms of just those two things. A sales tax is another thing. Fees are another thing. And cuts are part of it. People are not going to come together unless everyone has a stake in the outcome. But what we've done is we've gone to the weakest. We've taken, half of what we've taken is from kids and the poor. What on earth would we think that that's the first place to go? We should be ashamed of ourselves, collectively.
Thank you very much. And I've got one more question. This one's for the both of you. So we know that cutting the PFD will harm rural and lower income residents and families. Is anyone discussing or considering a guaranteed basic income that would go only to those with the greatest need, but not to those in higher brackets? I'm taking it, this is an audience question, to replace sort of the PFD.
It's a great question. I think there's something that you have to keep in mind when you think about the permanent fund system. The permanent fund system doesn't have a single dollar of taxes in it. It's only ownership income. And as such, it gives you the ability to avoid all the huge arguments in a guaranteed income system to tax one group and give it to another. If we are an owner state, and if our Constitution says for the benefit of all of the people, then the person who has no economic background, no economic base, owns just as much of the owner state as the richest person among us. And that's the equity that the permanent fund system is based on. It's not tax dollars. So it's a very different question. I don't think guaranteed annual incomes can succeed in a political process when you're taking from one and giving to another, and yet they make some economic sense because we spend half of everything we appropriate for many kinds of welfare in the administration of the welfare to keep the unneedy from getting it. It would be cheaper to give it to everybody and tax it back from the rich. But that's not an argument you're going to win in the political world.
Yeah, and I think there's some agreement with Rick and I there. It's one thing I looked at just as almost an intellectual exercise was, what if we means tested the dividend to mean what if only people in the bottom quartile would receive it? The political support, as you can imagine, for that was thin. It's not possible. I will say, and I agree with the premise that, first of all, that reducing the dividend impacts the poorest and children the most. Cuts to services impact the poorest and children the most. So it's an awful choice to have to make. But I will say this, if those dollars can be utilized and imagine the hypothetical where every dollar spent for this service had the equal amount of good of giving the person the dollar. I will say this, that the biggest beneficiary of the permanent fund dividend is the federal government. 25% of our permanent fund, hundreds of millions of dollars every year we ship to DC. If we keep that money here, it's used for state services. If it's used for pre-K, there's no reason on earth Alaska shouldn't have universal pre-K, for example. Low dollars, high reward. If we keep the dollars here, we don't offshore those dollars to DC. And I think that's one real tragedy we don't talk about is under a full dividend scenario, shipping $300 or $400 million to DC.
I don't think that number is nearly that high because so many people are in the kid side and the low income side. But there's no question that there's some leakage. There's some leakage everywhere. But the other side of it is we could also gain back on the income tax side from all the non-residents if you look at some of the other solutions.
And one final, I will point out that the larger the dividend gets, the higher the impact. My daughter, who's 13 now, the 1 year and only year I had to file a tax return for her was the year Sarah Palin gave every Alaskan $3,200 because my daughter had to file a tax return that year. And that would be the new reality. If we go to $4,000 and $5,000 dividends, we're all sending a good chunk of that money to the federal government.
We may have finally found something that they disagree on, at least a little bit. Thank all of the speakers from the top half for their remarks. I'd now like to welcome Brad Keithley to lead us off on the reinstatement of broad-based taxes and open up the back half.
Thank you, Drew. I want to commend Cliff or Drew or whoever put this order together because I think it's a very logical order in how we're addressing the issues, particularly when we come from PFD cuts to broad-based taxes. The current 10-year plan, as you've heard and as you've seen graphs, the current 10-year plan, the 10-year forward look projects an average of, on the chart, they had legislative finance at 1.5. For some reason, the governor's Office of Management and Budget projects a $1.8 billion annual deficit over the next decade. That is staggering. To put that in context, last year, after all of the battles we went through, after all of the fights we went through about budget cuts, we cut less, after the supplemental, we will have cut less than $100 million. That's what we did last year. We're facing $1.8 billion, 1.5 or $1.8 billion in deficits every year over the next 10 years, averaged over the next 10 years. That's 35% of spending. If you take spending at current levels plus inflation, the great inflation cap that everybody talks about, we're going to cap spending at inflation. If you take spending at current levels plus inflation, the deficit is 35% of that spending level. $1.8 billion is 35% of that spending level. And it's a staggering number. The question to me, and the question I think to a lot of people, is who pays? Who's going to pay to close that gap? Over the last 4 years, 5 years, we've used PFD cuts to close that gap. And as you heard Rick explain, that is the most regressive approach you possibly can take. The chart on the right is from a 2017 study done for House Finance by the Institute of Taxation and Economic Policy, a DC think tank, and it looked at the impact by income bracket of PFD cuts. We start on the far right with the top 1%. PFD cuts, and these are PFD cuts of $784 per person, that's intended to raise $500 million of revenue. If you look at the far right, the top 1%, that's 0.2% of their income. The next bracket over is the next 4%. The combined of those two is the top 5%. It's 0.6% of their income. The next 15%, it's 1.1% of their income. The fourth 20%, which is the middle income bracket, or the 60 to 80 income bracket, it's 1.6% of their income. The middle 20%, it's 2.5. The next to bottom 20%, it's 3.4% of their income, and this is just $784. And the bottom 20%, it's 7.2% of their income. These are effective tax rates, if you will, of the effect of PFD cuts, and they're skewed hugely to middle and lower income Alaska families. They don't touch the top 20% hardly at all. So the question really is, we have these staggering deficits, who's going to pay them? PFD cuts have the largest adverse impact. Doing it through PFD cuts have the largest adverse impact. Let me read something from the 2017 study. Reductions in the PFD are steeply regressive, having a far larger impact on families with lower incomes. A cut to the $784 cut to the PFD payout could free up approximately $500 million for Alaska's budget, but that gain would come at a high cost to Alaska's most vulnerable residents. Low-income families would expect to see their incomes cut by 7.2%, while middle-income families would amount to 2.5%, and high-income families would see impacts well below 1%. The impact on the bottom 20% of earners at 7.2% of income is nearly 10 times as large as the income faced by the top 20%. ICER did a study in 2016 about the impact of the PFD cut, and this was their conclusion. The impact of the PFD cut falls almost exclusively on residents and is highly regressive, so it has the largest adverse impact on the economy per dollar of revenues raised, and is by far the costliest measure for Alaska families. There are better ways to raise revenue. There are more equitable and less adverse impact, economic adverse impact on the Alaska economy. Sales taxes, income taxes, all have a much flatter impact across. All Alaskans contribute. Doing it the way we've been doing it through PFD cuts results in my timer going off, but also results in having the largest adverse impact on the most vulnerable middle and lower income Alaska families. We can do better.
Thank you very much, Brad. And I'd now like to welcome Tim Harper up to speak on behalf of the opposition.
Can you hear me? My name's Tim Harper. I'm a lifelong Alaskan. I've lived here my entire life. I've been through the crisis in the 80s, the high oil prices, low oil prices, and I have a really unique perspective. I've worked in corporate finance for various institutions here in town. I work for the Department of Revenue as a non-petroleum economist. As a petroleum economist, I was on the AKLNG Finance Committee. I ended up studying asset optimization of the state's financial assets during that time. I am opposed to broad-based taxes because there are significant revenues available to the state that have not been tapped into yet. Yeah, I can do that. Thank you. Mom, you were right. The typical argument is broad-based taxes hurt the economy. Sales taxes are highly regressive, income taxes are progressive, but you only tax a smaller portion of the population. It's not really equitable. We could do a flat tax, which is essentially reducing the permanent fund dividends. That's highly regressive. And so you end up going, well, what else is there? What else can you do? When I went to college, I went to a speech, and there was a guy was an inspirational speaker. And he stood there, and he did a painting, and each of these paintings represented famous people. The last painting he got to, he botched, or so it appeared. Instead, it was Jimi Hendrix painted upside down. You just didn't know it. So let me flip the portrait and put the final few lines on what you need to see. We need to reframe the issue. This is something that I learned. It's part of decision analysis. And we need to look through it through the lens of wealth. There's three things that happen to wealth. There's wealth creation, there's wealth reallocation, and there's wealth destruction. Permanent fund spending, if we were to exceed the PMV draw for it, would be a wealth destruction mechanism. For every additional $1 billion that we take out of the permanent fund, you lose $20 to $25 billion in future revenues. The broad-based tax, who's going to pay? There's a lot of fingers pointing around. Oil taxes. This is doubling down on what already hasn't worked. Our system is highly unstable, and it's not because it's not capable of generating huge amounts of revenue. It is. We've seen that before. And I think we collected $12 billion in 2012. It was on the earlier slide. So what we're really talking about is the risk profiles of all the different state revenues and how they interact in the system. And because our system's so unstable, it creates these issues that we're talking about here today. So when you look at the system and you look at the permanent fund, you realize that there's a mechanism there to act as a stabilization device. And there's more that we can do with the fund beyond just macroeconomic stabilization. We can generate additional revenues, and they're relatively, I would say that they're laying on the ground. It's not even fruit hanging in a tree at this point. We spend between $200 to $500 million a year on asset managers. 80% of that is we can do with in-house. They don't like to spend money on people managing the assets because it makes the budget increase. So if you just multiply the 200 million times 80%, that's real money. The reason it varies so much is it depends upon market performance. I had a really interesting conversation with the permanent fund chief investment officers. He was several of them ago. I said, "What do you do to manage risk?" And he said, "Oh, we diversify." And that's really good for your typical 401k response. But when you're managing billions of dollars, what do you do to manage your risk? And he said, oh, there's risk software out there. And I said, what kind of difference would it make? He says, oh, about 1% annually. And I said, how much does it cost? And he said, 1.2 million. And I was just like, wow, that's unbelievable. That IRR is, fantastic. And then we get to the capital structure. And this is a basic corporate finance graph. All this says to you is, this is the state with no debt. If the state were to take on some debt till its risk profile changed, it goes to what I call D1. The maximum value that you get is here. And there's this other point, D3. What's really interesting here is D3 and where we are right now are the exact same. So how much money are we leaving on the table? It's substantial. I estimate it's at least $1 to $2.2 billion in lost revenue each year. There's a quote by the U.S. Supreme Court Justice. He said, Alaska isn't like other states, and he's right. We have an opportunity to take advantage of something uniquely Alaskan, and at this point, I don't see a need for any broad-based taxes. Thank you.
All right, so I've got a couple of questions here. For Brad, are you at all concerned about Alaska losing its sort of tax-free status? Do you see any unique benefits associated with being the only state in the union that doesn't have broad-based taxes? And do you think there's sort of any economic impacts separate just from the imposition of the tax of sort of losing our lone wolf status as the one state you can go and not pay any income taxes or state sales taxes or anything like that?
No, it's the reverse. We've seen the cost to Alaska of not having broad-based taxes and not having all Alaskans participating in government. And that cost is we're staring $1.8 billion of deficits in the face per year over the next 10 years. We need to get Alaskans engaged, all Alaskans engaged. Part of the problem with using PFD cuts is the top 20% aren't engaged. They don't care. It's not a significant share of their income. They're not concerned about budget cuts. They're not concerned about going in and finding efficiencies because they're not paying for it. So a broad-based tax, sales tax, income tax, engages all Alaskans in their government. We start to push back on spending. We start to push back on policies that may help some segment, but are not justifiable across statewide. So I think it's the reverse. I think we've lost as a result of not having a broad-based tax and engaging all Alaskans in the Alaska budget.
Well, the audience seems to think that makes a pretty good question for Tim Harper. So if we do sort of successfully change our asset management, is there any sort of moral hazard with the government continuing to spend money that not really many of our friends and neighbors ever had to pay? If people don't have skin in the game, are we going to go back to spending on things that make somebody's brother-in-law feel good?
So the only reason that we have a permanent fund is because of the dividend checks, right? I mean, as we know it today, I think that protects the fund. So I don't think you can segment the population. It has to be all-inclusive. The issue becomes when you look through the wealth lens and you want to look at, for new sources of money, do you just want to reallocate wealth or do you want to bring in fresh dollars into the system? Those additional dollars that we onshore actually increase our standard of living. And that's what I'm arguing for.
Okay, and I'll finish it off with a question for both of you. Are these two positions mutually exclusive?
You mean, can we have taxes, broad-based taxes, and not have broad-based taxes? What's not mutually exclusive? Let me try it this way.
I thought it was a cute question that came up on a card. I'm taking it they meant it in terms of, Tim says we can get everything we need from restructuring the way that we invest the 60 billion plus we've got in the bank. And you're saying that it's real important we have broad-based taxes. Could we reinvest and get most of what we need and then spend even more with some taxes?
Look, if there's $1.2 billion in money that we're not getting from permanent fund investments, the next program that we need to have up here is Angela Riddell standing up here and explaining why that is. That'd be great. If there's $1.2 billion in revenue that we're not getting out of the way we invest the permanent fund, we ought to go after that with a heartbeat. But frankly, I think the permanent fund is fairly well run. And I think the investment profile of the permanent fund is a fairly good one. And I don't think, and I honestly don't think there's $1.2 billion there. So the question is, who's going to pay the deficit? And I think, again, that it should be all Alaskans contributing toward the cost of the state, not doing it in a way that shoves the costs down to middle and lower income Alaska families and letting the top 20% off the hook.
So I've looked at these numbers quite a bit. I spent 2 years of my life working on them very intensely. There are significant revenues that are untapped, and this is a short list. There's more. For example, if we had the $17 billion back that we had in the SBRF and the CBRF, we could have lended the money to the permanent fund and captured those earnings there where they would have been more sustainable. So there's options about how you sleeve risk. There's options about where you raise capital from. There's options about how you approach risk in the management of the fund. The fund is very well managed. They actually make more off of their private equity investments than we receive in petroleum royalties and production tax combined. So our state's changing. Doing more oil taxes or going to a wealth reallocation scheme where the uncertain connection to government exists because you're using one group or another group. I don't see it connecting everyone. I do think that the permanent fund formula needs to be changed, and it needs to be done in a manner where our two most valuable resources are looked after by the populace in a more sustainable manner than as a grab bag of quick fixes for any structural deficits that we run into from time to time. And right now, times are hard, right? I mean, it's not much fun. Oil prices range with a 90% confidence interval between $35 and $120 a barrel. The most likely price for it is probably about $55. And if you think about that distribution, it tells you it's highly skewed. And when you run that simulation across the production tax, the results are anywhere from 100 million to 2.5 billion, and the most likely outcome is $300 to $400 million. And it's not because, it's just a really tough system to gain any stability out of. And most people don't understand the risk that's embedded within the system. So I'm a little bit off track now.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks to both Tim and Brad, and now with plenty of foreshadowing from, I think, every speaker on the stage so far has mentioned in some way, shape, or form the industry and the taxes on it, because the industry doesn't need much introduction in this state. I'd like to invite Robin Brenna to begin our discussion of oil taxes.
Thank you all. It's my pleasure to be here with you tonight. Let me frame what I'm going to talk about within the context of what's been said, because there's a lot of things that I agree with. The first thing that I want to frame is that this isn't about oil taxes. This is about getting a fair share from the sale of our own oil. Now, it's our oil, it's our land, we should get a fair share. Everybody out there, raise your hand if you don't think that Alaska should get a fair share from their own oil. I don't see a single hand in the room, including from the person that's going to follow me. Okay, we should get a fair share of our oil regardless of whether we make cuts or don't get cuts, or how we spend our money. We should get a fair share before we go spend our savings or cut our PFDs. It makes no sense at all to spend our children's future or cut our PFDs while we continue to give away our oil to multinational corporations that are making twice as much in Alaska as they are in other major oil provinces. We should get our fair share before we tax ourselves. Does it make any sense to anybody out there to start taxing ourselves so we can continue to support giving away our oil to these companies? If we keep more of the revenue and wealth from our oil creates, we won't have to tax ourselves. You know, the idea of taking from our private sector and giving to our public sector doesn't add anything to the pie. We need to keep our oil wealth, more of it in Alaska and less of it from leaving Alaska. Governor Hammond had a famous quote. He said, if the day ever comes, and a prophetic quote, if the day ever comes when you don't have enough money for essential services in Alaska, the first place you should look is to be sure we're getting our third fair share from our oil revenues. You should do that before you consider broad-based taxes such as sales taxes and income taxes. So I don't disagree that this is a multifaceted problem that may require lots of solutions, but let me be absolutely clear as to which solution should come first. We shouldn't be giving away our oil and taxing ourselves and spending our savings and cutting our dividends. We should get a fair value for our oil first before we evaluate any other option. Alaskans aren't getting a fair share from our oil. We're giving up about $1.5 billion a year in tax breaks, unnecessary tax breaks, when Senate Bill 21 passed. We were promised more revenue, more investment, more jobs, and more production. We got none of them. We've lost 11,500 jobs, 5,500 in the oil sector. Our production has dropped. The investment that we gave away this money to get to create jobs, do you know what the 3 lowest years of investment on the North Slope have been in the last decade? The last 3 years. We are not getting investment for giving away our oil. We are losing investment and giving away our oil. How do we get our fair share? 2 major sources, as you saw, from royalties and production taxes. The royalties we get are 12.5%. That was embedded in an act in 1920, the Minerals Act. We get half of a modern royalty. Texans get 25% of a royalty. With regard to the production taxes, all of our taxes together, production taxes, income taxes, and corporate income taxes, all of those combined are 1.5% of the gross revenues that are leaving Alaska. Our production tax has been negative. You want to know why we're in the situation we're in? There's the slide. 5 years before Senate Bill 21 passed, we had $19 billion in revenues. 5 years from the production tax. 5 years after, we've lost money. This is 5 full years of revenue under our production tax. Now, the numbers you saw earlier had a positive number on that side. I've subtracted the credits that we have to pay from the amount that we get, which is the only fair thing to do. In fact, we are having to borrow $1 billion to pay production credits that we owe that we haven't even been able to afford to pay yet. So, in closing, because I see the red sign, let me say, let's keep some more of our money in Alaska. Let's get a production tax that works, and let's support Alaska's fair share from our oil, because all the solutions, if we can't get a fair share out of Prudhoe Bay that we're giving $740 million of credits to a year, if we can't get Prudhoe Bay right, then we've got the solution wrong. Thank you.
Many thanks to Mr. Brenna, and I'd now like to welcome Mr. Roger Marks, who is our last but certainly not least speaker.
Maybe the least. So, is this coming through okay? Good? Okay. So Common Ground asked me to come out tonight and discuss my concerns with the Fair Share Act. And my organizing theme is to be focused on certain accounting perceptions that seem to be driving the initiative, which in my judgment are problematic. And the first of these goes to the very heart of what the initiative says fair share is. On their website, the initiative says that fair share is the state getting 1/3 of gross revenues. And they say that because they say, Jay Hammond said that gross revenues should be split 1/3 each to the state, the federal government, and the producers. Now, it's not clear that Hammond said exactly that, but regardless, that's a problematic approach because gross revenues have to be split 4 ways, not 3. There's what the state gets, what the feds get, what the producers get, and the fourth piece is the upstream capital and operating costs incurred by the producers. These costs take up nearly 50% of gross value, and if the state's getting 33%, the producers are left with far less than 1/3. Nevertheless, the notion of the state getting 1/3 of gross revenue drives all the terms of the initiative. So if you want to see the concerns with the initiative, this is it on this graph. There are 3 lines on that graph. The left axis, the bottom axis is oil price. The left axis is what we call government take. It's the total state and federal taxes and royalties as a % of income. It's what many economists use to measure competitiveness. The bottom solid line shows the take from those jurisdictions where Alaska competes for investment. It's the average of 12 other places with tax and royalty regimes in the lower 48, North and South America, and Europe. It can be considered the competitive norm. The North Slope was developed by market forces, and the idea is fair share is what you can get in a competitive environment. That's what I think fair share is. The middle dotted line shows where Alaska currently is. It shows at low prices it's above the norm, at high prices it's above the norm, and it's competitive in the middle. And the top dashed line shows the initiative. This is what the state getting 1/3 of gross revenues looks like. It's a 340% tax increase, way above the norms. The per barrel credit, if you want to see what the current system looks like without the per barrel credit, the top line, the initiative, that's it. The 340% tax increase in the mid-range of prices consists of nothing but the elimination of the per barrel credit. The credit does not act like a credit in a traditional sense. It was designed to give the current system the shape it has. The same results could have been accomplished with a progressive tax table without calling it a credit. Think about the IRS eliminating your standard deduction. Other North Slope credits will be entirely phased out this year, and If you looked at the common ground graph of oil revenues each year, you notice the production tax was quite positive every year. The state owes money for past credits, about $700 million. That's what accumulated since starting in 2007 on a yearly basis. That's far, far less than what's come in with the severance tax. Those credits were put in place under ACES in 2007. They're owed to small companies. Their liabilities, and the state will still owe them whether the initiative passes or not. The thing is, we've tried this before more than once, and it didn't work. In the 1989 oil tax change, just like the Fair Share Acts, puts high oil tax rates for big fields. It provided a short-term revenue boost, but within months of that passing, the producers start switching investments from the high tax fields to the low tax fields. And the existing fields, once you stop investing, production goes into free fall. The tax became anemic, and production and revenue dropped. And the only difference between then and now is now they can switch their investments into the federal acreage where the state royalties will be much less. Under ACES, fiscal terms were way above the competitive norms. Producers made a lot more money everywhere else. Again, there was a short-term revenue boost. Production dropped 200,000 barrels a day in 6 years. In the last 7 years, with a competitive system, production has been stable. With more barrels, we're getting more revenues. The bottom line is you cannot yank $1.5 billion out of investor cash flow without them modifying their behavior. Finally, one more issue of problematic accounting is perceptions about Alaska profitability. A lot of people look at ConocoPhillips' combined per unit oil and natural gas profits and conclude Alaska is the most profitable place in the world to produce oil. In Alaska, ConocoPhillips operations are 100% oil. Everywhere else, they're about 50-50 oil and gas. And since oil and gas are produced together, their per unit profits are reported together. They're combined based on BTU content, but the BTU of oil is worth about 5 times as much as a BTU of gas. So when you blend oil and gas for financial reporting, you dilute the high-value oil with the low-value gas. So when you compare Alaska with other places, you are comparing the diluted operations everywhere else with the oil operations here. So in conclusion, much of this issue is about accounting. It's technical, and it's important, and I hope in the coming months, Alaskans understand these things before they vote. Thank you.
For Mr. Brenna, I think that I've heard a number of different instances that stability is king. And not just talking about the oil industry, but anytime you want to promote investment in anything. So I heard you sort of making the statement that the first place we should look is making sure we're getting our fair share from oil, but that makes it sound like that's where we're going to go and sort of change up our tax system every time we can't fill up the gas tank. So why do you think that we should be sort of looking there first instead treating oil as a nice to have thing and then just attempting to get the best deal that sort of works best for us?
Well, let me say that there's a lot of married folks in this audience, and you know that if you want stability, you have to be fair, right? I mean, am I wrong? So if you want a stable relationship, then the first thing you have to do is be fair to your business partner, your spouse. That's the first thing you have to do. So it comes back to what is a fair share. The Fair Share Act isn't based on a third, by the way. It's $1 billion increase. At least I learned where their 350% talking point came from. It came from a wrong calculation. So what we're doing, we're saying, Hammond said a third of gross. We're not after a third of gross. The average percent of gross over the last 40 years before Senate Bill 21 was set 27% of gross. If the Fair Share Act, when the Fair Share Act passes, we will have under our average for the last 30 years. Under our average, we'll be at about 26%. So we think that in the last 5 years, the industry has been given about $1.5 billion in tax breaks by the state, and they've been given about $600 million in tax breaks by the federal government. about $2 or $2.2 billion. What the Fair Share Act does is ask for about $1 billion of that back. And we think it's a fair share. We're not even going up to our historic average. And since oil started flowing on the North Slope to today, we've managed to get our fair share and investment in Alaska. In fact, Sarah Palin had a 38% of gross. Right now, our production tax for the last 5 years has brought in nothing. It's been negative, nothing. And our royalty tax is 12.5%, which is half of a modern royalty. So we aren't close to our fair share. We aren't close to what Sarah Palin brought in during that other period. And so I guess the answer is if you want stability, be fair with folks. The Fair Share Act adds $1 billion. That takes about half of the tax windfall that they've gotten over the last 5 years and keeps it in Alaska. And it's under our 30-year average. And if that's not fair to the producers, I don't know what is.
Now, Mr. Marks, I think that some of your comments were mentioned there, and you seem to be perhaps shifting in your seat a bit like you had something to say. Did you want to respond to that? If not, I've got a question for you.
Well, I could talk a little bit about the whole idea of fair share and what you, but that's sort of that may be a side issue. So.
I thought maybe there was a particular thing you needed to get off your chest. So I think that when SB 21 went through, I was a bit younger than I am now, but I seem to remember a number of promises about increasing the amount of oil through the pipeline. Did that happen? And if not, what happened?
Well, I don't recall any promises of that. What the whole. I mean, I worked on the design of SB 21. The whole goal was to make it competitive with other jurisdictions in terms of this government take. Since, if you look at what happened in the 6 years ACES was in effect, the tax rates were way above anywhere else in the world. The marginal tax rate, when oil prices shot up over $100, the marginal tax rate under ACES was over 90%. And so that means when the price of oil went up $1, the government got 90 cents. So companies couldn't make any money doing here, so they just invested everywhere else. And that era, prices went up nearly to $150 in 2008. That was a golden era in terms of oil investment, and it just bypassed Alaska completely because investment. There's just no reason. It was nuts to invest money here where you couldn't make any money. Production dropped 200,000 barrels a day. If you look at the Department of Revenue production forecast in 2013, before SB 21 passed, had SB 20, and these forecasts were always optimistic, but they were forecasting in this year, 2020, if ACES still is in effect, we'd have 100,000 barrels a day less now, and that was at a forecasted price of $120 a barrel. If you look at what's happened since SB 21, production has been stable. It was about 500,000 barrels a day when SB 21 passed. It's been stable since the last 7 years, and and look at today's prices, $62. So we're getting 100,000 barrels a day more at a price of $70 less.
So one more real big round of applause for all of our speakers, and then I'm going to have them talk one more time. So if you guys could pass the microphones back to the back half there, the back set of speakers, I was going to go ahead and give everybody an opportunity to say one thing you heard from somebody else on stage today that you maybe you liked or agreed with, or was a new take on things than something you'd heard before, something that made you think a little bit.
Okay, I guess I'm first. So, Mr. Harper here, I guess I didn't realize just how much waste we probably had. I mean, we all know government has waste or we're spending money the wrong way, but I'm actually very curious to look at those numbers more and see just how much it is, because that would be a really big deal for Alaskans. Of course, nobody wants more spending cuts and nobody wants broad-based taxes if we don't have to do them, but we're looking at a situation where that seems impossible to get through the next decade without some give there. And so if it is possible, what wonderful news.
I mean, there were a lot of things that were said. You know, I agree with one of the things that Robin said, which is in North Dakota and Texas, the modern royalty is somewhere between 20 and 30%. Alaska gets a 12.5% royalty. Conoco, even in the years that Mr. Marks said wasn't making money, they actually reported about $1.8 billion worth of profits in that year of $120 a barrel oil. So that's not true that they didn't make profits. The resonating thing, I think, is oil reform should be part of the solution, but no one of those things, we're going to have to get out of our ideological boxes, because no one of those things is going to solve this deficit at this point.
That sounded just like something that you hadn't ever thought before. I'm glad you shared it with the group.
It's the ex-politician in me.
I thought that Mr. Marks just now made a couple of really good points, because I think the only way we're going to get to real solutions is to get past the kind of sloganeering that goes on by all parties. I'm someone who actually agrees that there's a place for a broad-based tax. There may be a place to take another look at oil taxes, but the point he made that resonated with me was, we talk about these cashable credits, and ending those was actually one of the proudest things I worked on, because it was a debacle, but it was an artifact of the ACES system. It was an artifact of a net tax system. And then he went on to talk about the credits we talk about for the producing companies. We don't write them a check for $1 damn dollar. That's if espousing that is not helpful to the debate. Do they get a base deduction? Yes, just like I do for having kids or having a mortgage deduction. That's an artifact of a net tax system, not a gross tax system. And I think breaking through that clutter and comparing apples to apples is super important. We're not going to get anywhere to solutions if we hide the ball or if we're deceptive in our rhetoric.
Thank you much.
The older I get, the more I learn about what I don't know. But I think there's a lot of good information here, and there are solutions, and just remember, we are the luckiest people on the face of the earth.
I think learning what you don't know is called wisdom, Rick.
Too soon old, too late smart.
Does somebody want to pass one of the microphones down to Tim and Brad there?
Well, I'm going to agree that one of the things I hadn't heard before was Tim's point about the potential that we have revenues that we're not realizing out of the permanent fund through investment strategies in the permanent fund, and that would be interesting. I've not studied that. I've taken at face value that the things that I have looked at before about the permanent fund that we're investing well, and if there is some additional revenue that comes out of that, that would be great. I just don't think it's $1.2 billion, but anything counts. Any pennies in the couch count.
So the most valuable. Is this working? So the most valuable dollars that we have in the system are royalty dollars. That's because
part of those monies go into the fund. The key for me is how do you maximize the size of the fund, right? And that's to get additional investment in the oil patch. So when you look at it from an investor standpoint, I would totally agree with Roger. We really need to be focused on what grows the fund the most. I really don't hope that we repeat the mistakes of old, where we go back and we raise taxes on the oil companies again. It's been our traditional balancing the budget metric, and I really hope that we can move beyond that. Thank you.
Well, I guess I have two things. One is that there are different pots of money in Alaska. Alaska Industrial has some, and Alaska Housing has some that I think are underutilized and underinvested. The permanent fund has been making historically 8 or 9%, and we have underperforming funds. And we just can no longer afford to have pots of money sitting around making 2 or 3%. So I think that the point's well taken. With regard to, I agree with Mr. Kendall that eliminating the production credits, the paid credits was an important step. But what that did is it threw the new guys under the bus and kept paying, allowing $744 million a year of production credits to be subtracted from Prudhoe Bay. And that's subtracted dollar for dollar off the amount that they owe us. So in terms of eliminating the credits, I think the legislature did one step, and we need to do one more and eliminate the credits that are unnecessary. And we're giving $740 million of credits in Prudhoe. They're investing $210 million in capital a year, and they're making $4 billion. What are we doing incentivizing production out of Prudhoe when it was produced for 3 decades without those incentives?
People just can't seem to resist learning new things about oil taxes up here, even though I thought they were experts coming onto the stage. Last one, Roger.
Okay, well, 40 years ago, the state made 3 decisions that worked back then and don't work now. One is we could finance 90% of our budget with oil. Back then, there was 2 million barrels a day. The population was less, the budget was less. The other decision is we had more money than we knew what to do with, and so we could afford to pay these dividends out of the permanent fund earnings. That is not the case anymore. And the third decision was we got rid of an income tax, and maybe it's time to do like the rest of the world does and start paying for the things we want.
A heartfelt thank you to all the speakers and to our wonderful audience. You guys were great. Thank you very much for coming out.